Let's change subject slightly and talk a little bit about interest rates. One of my favorite topics in our current inflationary environment. We've been looking. I guess the last inflation numbers were at 6.5%,
Right.
and the last time I checked, the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond was 3.5%. So we're talking about a real negative interest rate of 3%. And obviously, that's sort of unprecedented and presumably not sustainable. How does your model deal with the whole sort of interest rate issue?
Yeah, the inflation expectation, the forward-looking rate is really crucial here because the market certainly is not pricing that high. In fact, if you look at the forward rates and you subtract those from the nominals, that you are getting up now a positive real interest rate. But right now, what we typically are doing in our discounting of future liabilities and tax revenues, we are using the government 30-year Treasury yield. And so there's no question in the short run, there might be some, disturbance there. But, what we find is that even if you go out further in time, things even get worse. And so, we're actually being kind of optimistic here when we talk about the 225% number. If you actually were to do a longer horizon, then what we find is that if the government were try to go on a sustainable path forever, it would forever have to increase tax revenue across all sources of income at the federal level, both the income tax, business side, as well as payroll tax side by 40%, or reduce its spending forever by 30%, or some combination of both. There are additional reasons, including some macro effects, of why those numbers are actually a bit, optimistic. I mean, if you include in macro effects, things could even get worse than that. So, if anything, we're still biased a bit toward, a tamer message rather than this pessimistic message. But yes, during the short run, we are incorporating more some disturbance there, but we are using market data about forward-looking expectations and inflation, which is much tamer than what we've seen in the last couple of years.
So before we leave the topic, what's sort of the long run? I mean, you may not really get to a steady state in your model, but in terms of 2050, what are we sort of looking at in terms of real interest rates out in the long run?
Oh, yeah, we didn't report that here, but so if I can say what we're right now doing is using the 30-year yield along the path that we're showing here. And so, but if we were to report out the interest rate, we're going from basically close to a zero-ish real yield today to over a 2% real yield by 2050. I don't believe, for example, with these numbers, that the Federal Reserve will ever get back to its 2% rule. It could get there for a while. I don't think it will be able to stay there unless Congress takes some pretty sizable action. But it's an increase in real interest rates about close to between today and then by 2050 of about a little less than, say, 2% real.
So what you mentioned inflation, I mean, the Fed has a target. Of course, this is the personal consumption expenditure index, which is a little different than the CPI.
Yeah.
But what sort of, do you look at both of those, and what's sort of your long run inflation rate?
We do. And so we are assuming that the Fed, for these calculations, that is able to get back to the 2% because that's their stated mission, and we're trying to do everything under current law and not ever make an assumption about how Congress will change its mind or things like that. We're really trying to say, if we stay on this current path, including the Federal Reserve gets back to the 2%, this is the path that we are on. Because these estimates are conventional, they correspond more to what CBO would describe their estimates to be, except they're, again, more aggregated. Ours is more bottom up. We are not incorporating a lot of the macro feedback effects here. The situation would get even worse because you would get a contraction of GDP. We are actually going to, in about a month and a half, show with a newer model that's this big math exercise, a very intense computational framework, show that debt is even more, has a bigger deterioration on the economy than what we as Penn Wharton Budget Model have shown in the past. And that's simply coming through a richer dynamics that we're able to model with some math breakthroughs as well as some computational estimates. And it is pretty, it's pretty nerve-wracking what those estimates will show.
Well, that's the way. That's a way to tease your next appearance.
Yeah.